Seneca the Younger says that social media corrupts society. Or at least we might imagine he would say that. Probably not through the way that you think he would, or through any of the kind of normal arguments that we hear about digital media, but through a very particular one that he makes in his treatise on clemency, which he wrote to Nero Caesar. Nero, who, I can't remember his age, something like 16 or 17, becomes emperor of Rome. And Seneca, as a sort of teacher to him, writes this treatise on clemency, which is sort of this argument for how a ruler should live for society to be strong and stable. And he's warning Nero of not destroying his life and the life of the empire through a lack of clemency, which is sort of a form of mercy. And as I read this, I couldn't help but be reminded of how we all live today in a digital age. We're our own miniature emperor. We're all CEOs of our own brand, and social media is our publishing house, and our life, we can do what we want as kings of ourselves. But there's something really interesting that happens when we use social media. We end up seeing all sorts of bad behavior and evil, and it happens over and over, and we begin to think that everybody is bad. And we all want everyone to be punished maximally at the fullest possible way. And what ends up happening, interestingly enough, is that we create a kind of, let's say, a culture that lacks clemency, a culture that lacks mercy, a culture that assumes the worst in each other and wants to punish each other maximally. To understand this, I'm going to talk first about Seneca on crime, Seneca on slavery, and also Seneca on his imagined argument on social media. So first, Seneca on crime. In the first book of On Clemency, in chapter 23, section 1, he says, and I'll read the quote here, "You'll see, moreover, that crimes commonly punish the ones commonly committed. The men of a very distant past, who were supremely far-sighted and very canny about the nature of things, preferred to overlook the crime as though it were unthinkable and beyond all daring, rather than punish it and thereby show that it could be committed. Thus parricides came into existence, along with the law. Parricides, murder father. As the punishment drew their attention to the deed, filial devotion reaches nadir once we saw more sacks than crosses." In context, Seneca seems to be drawn on how Tiberius used something called poena culae, which was a way to punish those who murdered their fathers by throwing them in a sack, alive with wild animals, and then tossing them into a river. It was a severe punishment, but despite this punishment happening over and over, parricide increased. It did not decrease, and something was interesting. The more that law was enforced and talked about, the more people wanted to break that law. It's where there was the sin and law came to expose that sin increased ever more. And it wasn't the problem of the law. It's always right to honor your father and mother. The problem was something to do with us and something to do with how we respond to law. Seneca continues, "In a community where people are rarely punished, innocence comes to enjoy general support and is kindly regarded as a common good. Provided that a community thinks itself innocent, it will be. It will be more indignant at those who depart from the general standard of goodness if it sees that they are few. It's risky, believe me, to let a community see how many wicked men there are." So what you have here is this idea that if you strenuously and always enforce all law at all times, people, because we all break the law, we all do something wrong, we all maybe speed or whatever it is, you will, everyone will just be a lawbreaker. Everyone will speed, everyone will break the law. We all know this. And what'll end up happening is that people will stop caring. They're like, well, if everyone runs a stop sign, why shouldn't I? If everyone goes 10 over the speed limit, why shouldn't I go 10 over the speed limit? This is already kind of something that happens locally, something that you can recognize. And it gets risky because we're going to see that everyone else is evil and we become cynics and just want to do the same evil. It's interesting in the biblical tradition. There's something interesting in terms of a parallel. Jesus in Matthew 19 says, in the beginning, God created man and woman for marriage, and some Pharisees come up to him and say, "Well, why did Moses command divorce then in the matter of moral indecency?" And Jesus has to correct them and saying, "Well, he didn't give you a command; he gave you an allowance, and he didn't command that you should divorce someone for any matter. There's some more context there, but the point is, what seems to be happening there is that when there's an allowance for divorce, in this case, more people will want to, and it becomes normal, and you find ways to justify it. Everyone has to do it. The disciples in context seem to be pretty shocked at the permanence of marriage teaching in Matthew 19, and they think maybe no one should ever be married. Paul the Apostle, likewise, in Romans 7, has this idea that where the law increased and exposed sin, sin also increased. And his point seems to be that as law became clear, more people, I guess, pushed back on it, broke the law, wanted to break it, couldn't find that they couldn't. And he asked the question then, well, why have law at all? And the answer is, well, at least from Paul's perspective, it's not the problem of the law, it's a problem of the person. We are broken and disordered in our desires. Why have law at all in the bigger picture? Well, it's not that all law is wrong, but there seemed to be some sort of balance that Seneca is arguing for. There needs to be clemency, there needs to be rules and laws, but the punishment itself is the thing that we need to balance. A good emperor, people love him because although he could justly punish someone severely, he uses clemency, which is the virtue of mildness in punishment, mildness in mind when you punish someone, sometimes even not punishing them, based on the virtue of clemency. Seneca develops a similar point, or the point itself, through an illustration of slavery. His point is that if everyone knows, there was this time in Roman history where people wanted to distinguish freedmen and slaves by their dress, but then he recognized the problem that if everyone knew who was a slave and who was free, the slaves might realize that they have more power than they know. They might be the majority. They might have, significant power. So Seneca says, quote, "It was once upon a time proposed in the Senate that slaves should be distinguished from freedmen by their dress. It then became apparent how much danger would threaten if our slaves began to count us. Be sure that we would have to fear the same outcome if none received forgiveness. It would quickly have become apparent how preponderant the worst segment of the community was. Having many occasions for punishment is no less a disgrace for a prince than many deaths are for a doctor. People better obey someone who gives his order in a milder manner." Now, granted, today we reject slavery for good reason. In the Christian tradition, the clearest early proponent would be Gregory of Nyssa that I know of, who argued strongly that because people are created in God's image, you can't own them and you must treat them as equal. But the illustration is just worth bringing out because if you realize that some have less and some have more, and it will create this sort of imbalance in society. If you focus on the problems, then the problems get worse, you might say. Focus on the solutions, of course, and find resolutions. That's not what I'm saying we shouldn't do. But, if you focus on the difference, the proportional difference too greatly, then there could be a societal problem. And every society has a breakdown. Seneca further observes, "The human mind is stubborn by nature, struggling against anything that opposes it or puts an obstacle in its way, and it follows its own more readily than it is led. Just as noble thoroughbred horses are better guided with a loose rein, so a willing innocence follows clemency with an impulse all its own, and the community thinks it worth preserving for its own good. This is the path in which we make more progress." So by offering public clemency, society gets safer. I mean, this is largely the case that if Nero were to be cruel and unkind to everyone around him, they'd want to hurt him, harm him, get even with him. He wouldn't feel safe. In fact, people wouldn't love him. They'd fear him and want to kill him. There's counter illustrations of this. Augustus Caesar forgives someone who tried to murder him, and they become good friends afterwards on the basis of love and trust, not on the basis of fear. So what would his imagined argument against social media be? Well, one of Seneca's points is that concealing the full extent of vices helps social order. If we knew everyone that was deprivileged, everyone was privileged in a really clear way, instead of actually finding ways to solve the problem effectively, we would focus on the disproportionate success or lack of success, or privileges or lack of privileges, and we would fall apart, hate each other, etc. Now, if you know those differences, you should resolve them, fix them. That's not the point. It's saying that if you focus on those things, you actually divide yourself further apart. And likewise, if all crime, petty crime especially, were punished, people would despair at how lawless things are. They would just assume everyone's evil and become cynical. And by analogy, when every failing mistake or outburst is recorded on social media, when we have quote tweets of every dumb thing said, or every video, or a video of every terrible thing happening, we begin to get highly skeptical or cynical of other people. This happens when you see bad pastors or religious leaders online for Christians. They think they're all terrible. Same thing's true in politics. When you keep seeing the terrible things of politicians, you think that all politicians are terrible. And you become cynical and you want to get even with everyone. This is just like Seneca feared that if Rome was able to see that every vice was present and all vices were punished, it would create an unstable and disastrous Rome, which seemed to be precisely what happened with Nero's reign. You can Google it afterwards. His reign was not marked by clemency, but by everything that Seneca warned against. But we live in an overly litigious, hyper-transparent culture of surveillance, and it's unraveled public morality, or at least it's contributed to it. We see so much evil, war, disorder, and so on, we assume everyone is like that. We look at whole cultures of people and write them off by thinking that if some people from that culture are bad, they must all be bad, or just hyper-cynical. I spoke to a bus driver recently who said all politicians are corrupt, and while many politicians may be corrupt, it's a cynical point of view that sees public service in this way. And yet TV, social media, all sorts of digital service emphasizes the corruption of people. We have daily videos of rudeness, crime, disorder, and it stirs up our indignation. Well-known people are sharing things with us who are our leaders, and we become cruel. We enjoy getting even with the other side. We hate our enemies rather than love them. We don't have patience. We have anger. We are not at all ready to exercise clemency, mildness in judgment, or punishment. But rather, we are ready to exercise cruelty, which is the opposing vice to clemency. We love cruelty. We lambast others in line, and we mock them as if the internet is an online battle royale. To quote Seneca once again, cruelty is the least human sort of evil, and unworthy of the gentle mind of man. It's a bestial sort of madness to take delight in bloody wounds, casting off one's humanity to assume the character of some woodland creature. More succinctly, the Bible says love covers a multitude of sins. Ultimately, Seneca seems to be right. We need presidents, judges, leaders, and ordinary people to exercise clemency. We're too quick to cancel, destroy, wreck, get even, nurse vengeance, or resentment, rather. And through that, we lack a sort of public morality. We are too cynical. We don't trust in one another. And I think Seneca's advice remains valuable today, not because he had a flawless moral code. In fact, I think we'd all argue that his tolerance of slavery is intolerable. But what he does show us is a unique insight into human nature. There will always be a place for justice and a strong rebuke, and strict justice. Strictness is actually a vice. It's good. Something or maybe it's an application of a virtue. It's good. But we still must learn a key lesson. Cruelty destroys, clemency preserves, and justice must always guide us. And as Peter the Apostle reminds us, love covers a multitude of sins. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Also, watch the video above my shoulder right now.